The Mafia boss is feared by every gangster in the city, but terrified of losing her, the bartender. Dominic Valenti stood at the center of the crowded River North Gallery, a black suit molded perfectly to his broad shoulders. His gray eyes scanned the room, cold and precise, taking in the wealthy patrons, the clinking glasses, the murmurs of admiration and fear. He was the man whose name alone controlled Chicago, whose presence could shift deals and silence rivals without a single word. Across the room, Celeste Monroe froze. Her dark hair clung to her face, tears sliding down her cheeks. He had just dismissed her as no one important, and the words cut deeper than any bullet could. For a moment, Dominic saw her not as a bartender, not as someone ordinary, but as the one person who had managed to break through his walls, who had touched a part of him he rarely allowed to exist. Now, standing in the golden glow of chandeliers, the most feared man in the city realized he had crossed a line he could never undo. Her eyes met his, a mixture of hurt and disbelief, and he understood that this night would change everything, if she let it. How did a man like Dominic fall for a woman like Celeste? What happens when their two worlds collide? Comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss tomorrow's next chapter. A special shout out to all our viewers, both new and returning, from the United States, Canada, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and every corner of the world. Thank you for being here and supporting these stories. You're the reason we keep creating them. Now let's begin. Dominic Valenti moved through his office with the precision of a man accustomed to total control. At 42, his frame remained imposing, broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and the kind of posture that suggested command even without a word. His dark hair, always slicked back, framed a sharp jawline, and the gray of his eyes was often mistaken for coldness, though it was calculation. The black suit he wore, tailored in Milan, clung perfectly to him, expensive enough to draw attention if anyone dared to notice. His watch, a limited edition chronograph, was more than most could earn in a decade, yet it was merely a part of his armor. Dominic had learned early that appearances could communicate power before a word was spoken. From his office in the Fulton Market District, he could see the city he ruled. The skyline stretched before him, Willis Tower rising like a sentinel over Chicago's restless streets. Below, the shipping yards along Lake Michigan moved with the rhythm of commerce, often under the control of men who answered only to him. On Rush Street, neon lights reflected in puddles from last night's rain, illuminating gambling dens where fortunes changed hands under Dominic's unseen watch. Every corner of the city where law and lawlessness intersected carried his mark, even if most never saw him. Dominic had not inherited his position. He had earned it, piece by piece, through 2 decades of calculated action. Rivals who underestimated him were gone. Some quietly removed, others eliminated with precision that left warnings without attracting law enforcement attention. The whispers that followed his decisions were enough to maintain dominance. Cross Dominic Valenti, and you cease to exist. Those who feared him did not speak loudly. The silence around his name was far more telling than shouts of terror. Yet Dominic's empire was not built purely on brutality. He had contradictions that perplexed those around him. His suits were exquisite, his cars immaculate, and his reputation untouchable, but he also gave anonymously to children's hospitals and shelters throughout Cook County. Every Sunday, he attended Mass at Old St. Patrick's Church, kneeling in the back pew with his head bowed, speaking prayers that seemed meant for no one but himself. The contrast between generosity and ruthlessness was something few understood, and fewer dared to question. Power had cost him personal connections. Loneliness wrapped around him like a second skin, one he refused to acknowledge even to himself. Friends were tools, enemies were instruments, and love. Love had been a risk he no longer permitted. Trust had a high price, and Dominic had long since decided that no one was worth it. To show weakness was unthinkable. To let someone close was unwise. Every decision in his life had reinforced these rules, and he lived by them with unwavering certainty. Every meeting he held reflected the world he commanded. In boardrooms above Italian restaurants in Little Italy, deals were finalized in whispers, the agreements often backed by unspoken threats. At the docks, men who managed shipping and transport reported to him, their loyalty rooted in both fear and the rewards of obedience. The city's politicians knew when to act in his favor, the police looked away when necessary. Dominic's influence flowed like a silent river through Chicago, touching every layer of society without being fully seen. Despite the control he exercised, Dominic understood the fragility of reputation. One misstep, one display of doubt, and his carefully constructed world could crumble. He had observed rivals fall because they allowed emotion or desire to interfere with judgment. Dominic Valenti had vowed never to be one of them. His life was a series of decisions that kept him above suspicion, above harm, and above weakness. And yet, Dominic was about to confront a situation where all his control, all his carefully maintained distance, meant nothing. One person existed in his life who operated outside the rules he had so ruthlessly enforced. One person who could see him without fear, without respect for his power, and without the obligations that others carried. For the first time in 20 years, a man who had ruled Chicago from shadows and glass would discover a world where wealth, reputation, and authority offered no protection. The woman who had managed this impossible feat was unknown to the city's elite, invisible in public, yet utterly essential to him. In a matter of hours, Dominic Valenti would stand at the threshold of the only place where he could not dictate terms, the only situation where he was powerless to shield himself from the truth of his own heart. The Velvet Hour sat quietly on Milwaukee Avenue in Wicker Park. From the outside, it looked ordinary, weathered brick, a faded sign, windows streaked from years of Chicago rain. Few gave it a second glance. Inside, however, the bar carried a warmth that drew people in, a soft golden glow from aged lamps illuminating dark wood tables and shelves stacked with bottles that reflected the light like liquid amber. The hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clink of glasses, creating a rhythm that felt familiar, intimate. Celeste Monroe moved behind the bar with effortless grace. At 31, her dark hair fell just past her shoulders, framing a face marked by both resilience and subtle elegance. Her whiskey-colored eyes, steady and observant, seemed to absorb everything around her. Patrons often found themselves speaking more freely than they intended, sharing parts of themselves that would remain hidden elsewhere. She had learned early how to listen, not just to words but to the quiet currents beneath them. Her life had not been easy. Growing up on the South Side, she lived in a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner on Archer Avenue. Her mother worked 2 jobs, nights and weekends, to keep food on the table after her father walked out when Celeste was only 7. Those early years left a mark, an understanding of struggle, a sharpness born of necessity, and a determination not to let circumstance define her. Despite the hardships, Celeste nurtured ambitions. She dreamed of writing stories that captured the grit, beauty, and contradictions of the city she loved. Literature became her refuge, and the University of Illinois at Chicago her path. Nights were long, filled with classes, study sessions, and shifts at various bars to cover tuition. Sleep was scarce, bills were constant, but she persevered. Over time, however, the weight of student loans, rent, and the relentless demands of adulthood began to eclipse those early dreams. Yet the Velvet Hour offered something she had not expected: purpose. Giuseppe, the elderly owner, had hired her on a hunch, and in her 4 years there, Celeste had become far more than a bartender. She became a witness to the city's private moments, the confidant to its secrets. Politicians spoke freely when they thought no one was listening. Businessmen revealed their hidden fears. Law enforcement officers spoke softly of what they could not officially disclose. She held these confidences tightly, never exploiting the trust placed in her. Her reputation for integrity became unspoken yet absolute. Those who knew her understood she could be trusted without question. Celeste's gift for listening extended beyond attention to words. She noticed patterns, the slight changes in tone, the weight of pauses. She learned what people feared, what they hoped for, and what they hid even from themselves. Many came seeking advice, though she offered little in response, letting the act of speaking provide them clarity. Others simply needed to feel heard. Through it all, she maintained an inner calm, a quiet strength that came from years of self-reliance and the necessity of understanding the world on her own terms. Her days and nights were filled with small routines that grounded her. She kept her bar organized, always polishing glasses until they caught the light just right. She catalogued her favorite books, scribbled notes for stories she intended to finish someday, and prepared cocktails with care, never allowing haste to spoil precision. Her attention to detail was subtle, but noticed by regulars. They came not only for drinks but for the assurance that someone present understood the nuances of life outside the grand events of the city, beyond the reach of ambition and power. Celeste had long ago learned to protect herself emotionally, keeping her heart in careful compartments. Yet beneath that composed exterior, she carried a hope she rarely allowed to surface. The hope that life could deliver something meaningful, something real beyond survival. She did not seek romance, not in any conventional sense, but she had not closed herself off completely. There was room for connection, though it was defined by rules she alone understood. Then, one rainy October evening 3 years ago, a man arrived who would challenge all of her boundaries. The rain streaked the windows of the Velvet Hour as the door opened, letting in a sudden draft that carried the scent of wet asphalt and cold streets. Patrons barely noticed him at first, focused on their own conversations and drinks, but Celeste's eyes caught his immediately. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a black suit that fit with an exactness that spoke of both wealth and discipline. His hair was slicked back, and his gray eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the room as if evaluating everything at once. He moved alone, leaving anyone else who might have accompanied him behind. There was an authority in his presence, a certainty that demanded attention without demanding submission. Celeste felt the weight of it immediately, not as fear, but as recognition. She had seen people who carried influence, men and women who commanded rooms through reputation alone, but something in him suggested more: depth, calculation, and a quiet intensity that seemed entirely unrelated to the bar or the patrons within it. He approached, standing at the edge of her bar. Celeste's hands paused mid-motion, a glass suspended between her fingers. For a moment, there was nothing but observation, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. She poured his drink with care, noting the steadiness of her own hands despite the sudden shift in energy. That night, the first conversation stretched until closing. Words about books, music, and the city's overlooked corners filled the space, revealing a shared understanding of the world in ways neither could have predicted. Something had begun, subtle but undeniable. Celeste, who had built her life around order, observation, and self-reliance, would soon find that a man who commanded entire city blocks could introduce a new form of chaos, one that touched the heart. The rain had fallen steadily all afternoon, turning North Avenue into a slick river of black and silver. Dominic's driver slowed to a crawl, navigating around a traffic accident that had snarled the usual flow of cars. Dominic, seated in the back of the black Mercedes, watched the streets pass with a detached intensity. His gray eyes scanned faces, storefronts, and traffic lights, though nothing caught his attention until a worn sign drew his gaze. The faded letters of the Velvet Hour stood out against the wet city, modest and unassuming. He instructed the driver to stop. Without a word, he stepped out of the car alone, leaving the two men who had followed him silently for years waiting in the vehicle. The city's chill bit at his tailored black suit, but he moved with deliberate ease, as if he belonged to every street he passed. When he pushed open the door to the bar, the warmth hit him first: soft golden light, low conversation, and the muted hum of a Cubs game on a corner television. The bar was half empty. Dominic surveyed the room, noting the few patrons scattered among the tables. No one turned to acknowledge him. No one whispered. He could have been anyone here, a man among many. That anonymity was unexpected, yet it drew him closer to the counter, where a woman with dark hair and amber-colored eyes worked with a calm focus that demanded attention without asking for it. Celeste noticed him immediately, though she did not recognize the magnitude of the presence before her. He approached the bar and slid onto a stool. She poured Blanton's bourbon with practiced care, watching him carefully. There was something in his posture, a weight he carried beyond mere fatigue or concern. She offered a soft observation. You seem like you carry the city on your shoulders. Dominic regarded her, initially silent, then allowed the faintest half-smile. It was not a smile meant to charm, it was measured, controlled. Still, it was enough to hold her attention. Conversation followed naturally, as if the hours in the bar had been designed for this moment. They spoke of books, of music, of the streets and stories of the city. For in the morning passed unnoticed, each sentence forming a connection neither had anticipated. He returned the following night. And the night after that. Weeks became months. Their exchanges deepened, growing from polite conversation into something more personal. They debated Hemingway's sparse sentences, dissected Fitzgerald's characters, and shared passages from Toni Morrison and James Baldwin. Each discussion revealed a layer of understanding, a recognition of intellect and depth that Dominic had rarely encountered, and Celeste found herself equally drawn to his sharp mind beneath the steely exterior. Tension built subtly. A hand brushing against another's while reaching for a glass. A glance held longer than necessary. The warmth in his chest that she stirred, and the longing in her eyes that he could not ignore. Their connection was electric yet contained, restrained by the unspoken rules each carried. Neither wanted to act too soon, yet neither could remain indifferent. Spring brought change. The bar had emptied for the night, the soft hum of conversation replaced by silence. Celeste closed the last of the registers, wiped the counter, and leaned against it, catching her breath after the long evening. Dominic remained at the bar, quiet, watching. Then, as if the distance between them had grown too great to endure, he moved. The first touch was tentative, almost hesitant. His hand brushed hers, and she did not pull away. The line they had both avoided for months disappeared in that single, tremulous gesture. Dominic's hands were gentle in ways that surprised him. His touch was careful, as though he feared damaging what had been built through conversation, laughter, and shared understanding. Celeste responded in kind, allowing herself to be held, to feel, to trust in a way she had not allowed anyone before. Afterward, he held her close, sitting on the edge of the bar with her in his arms. She fell asleep in the quiet warmth of his embrace, the exhaustion of weeks and months finally breaking over her. Dominic watched her, heart racing. He had faced enemies who threatened his empire, rivals who would kill without hesitation, yet he had never felt fear like this. Fear of losing her, of exposing the one part of himself that existed outside power, outside fear, outside control. That night marked the beginning of a secret arrangement. Late nights at her apartment in Pilsen became their sanctuary. Above a Mexican bakery on 18th Street, with the smell of fresh tortillas and coffee drifting from the floor below, they built a private world. It was small, simple, and profoundly intimate, a place where Dominic's reputation meant nothing, where the weight of his empire did not reach. In that apartment, conversation continued. They explored music, literature, and art. Sometimes there was silence, comfortable and unforced, as they simply existed together. Every smile, every laugh, every touch became a thread of connection that neither wanted to sever. He was still Dominic Valenti, feared by many, commanding entire city blocks, yet in that small space, none of that mattered. Despite the intensity of their private world, the outside remained unchanged. In public, she was invisible. Patrons of the Velvet Hour continued to see her as the bartender who knew their stories, not the woman who had stirred a man who controlled the city's underworld. Dominic continued to move through his life with his usual precision and authority, yet each decision, each glance over his shoulder, was measured against the risk of losing the one person who had come to matter more than power or control. Their private connection became a force neither had anticipated. It was intellectual, emotional, and physical. A layering of intimacy that deepened over months. Every visit, every meeting, reinforced the quiet truth that had begun that first rainy October night. They were bound by a need that neither could fully explain, a recognition of a bond that could not be forced, only nurtured. As the months passed, the city carried on around them, unaware of the clandestine relationship that thrived above a modest bar and beneath the shadow of Chicago's skyline. Dominic's life of control and calculation had intersected with Celeste's quiet resilience, producing a tension that neither could ignore and neither could escape. Their meetings remained carefully guarded, but each encounter strengthened the truth they were discovering together. Some connections transcend circumstance, surpassing fear, expectation, and even reason. Dominic parked several blocks from Celeste's apartment, the collar of his black coat turned up against the sharp March wind. He walked the few blocks, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes alert but distant, as if measuring every detail of the streets he had known for years. The city's hum felt muted compared to the intensity of his thoughts. Entering her building quietly, he carried nothing but a small bag with dinner ingredients. Tonight, as with many nights, they would retreat to the apartment above the Mexican bakery on 18th Street, their private refuge from a world that demanded vigilance, calculation, and control. Inside, Celeste moved with calm efficiency. She welcomed him with a faint smile, her dark hair tucked behind her ears, whiskey-colored eyes scanning him as if she could read what he chose not to reveal. He unpacked the ingredients while she lit candles, filling the room with a soft amber glow. The kitchen became their stage, chopping, stirring, and seasoning in synchrony, an unspoken rhythm guiding their movements. Dinner was simple: pasta, fresh vegetables, and a bottle of wine, but the quiet intimacy made the act feel grand. Afterwards, they danced. Frank Sinatra played softly from a corner speaker, and Dominic's strong arms held her close. They moved slowly, deliberately, neither needing words. The night stretched, measured in heartbeats, brush of skin, and the faint smell of wine and lingering rain. They spoke afterward, sitting on the small balcony, looking toward the distant lights of the city. Conversations wandered into deeper territory: his mother, who had died quietly in her home, her father, absent since she was a child. Shared memories and vulnerabilities were exchanged carefully, tested by trust and nurtured by their growing connection. Each touch, each shared glance, left them both breathless and aching. Dominic's control, the armor that had protected him for decades, seemed irrelevant here. Celeste's presence demanded openness he had rarely allowed himself. She became both sanctuary and mirror, reflecting not the feared crime boss but the man he could have been if life had been different. Yet mornings brought the familiar duality. Dominic left as silently as he had arrived. The world outside their apartment required the persona that had built empires and inspired fear. He walked through crowded streets, greeted politicians and businessmen with a reserved nod, and never acknowledged the woman whose life had become intertwined with his own. To the public, Celeste remained invisible, the bartender at the velvet hour, competent and unassuming, unaware that the most dangerous man in the city considered her essential. This arrangement, however delicate, began to weigh. Every encounter in public, every glance at her across the bar, reminded him of what he could not afford. And every moment alone amplified the reality of what he had found, an emotional bond he could not walk away from, even if his instincts demanded distance. He knew the world demanded power, visibility, and control. She demanded presence, honesty, and attention. Managing both became an unspoken tension between them, threaded into their daily routines, private laughter, and shared meals. The city beyond the apartment remained unaware, yet Dominic felt its pressures with every step outside. Every dinner, every meeting with associates, was conducted with a mind divided between empire and the fragile intimacy he had cultivated with Celeste. He began to notice the contrast more acutely, the mundane, nearly invisible gestures at the apartment against the formal, commanding gestures in public. And though he prided himself on control, he found himself unable to separate one from the other entirely. This balance defined them. The stolen nights, the whispered conversations, the quiet meals, they became essential to him. They reminded him that beneath the reputation, the money and the fear, he was capable of desire, care, and gentleness. For Celeste, these nights were equally transformative, a respite from a city she had navigated for years, revealing a world of protection, attention, and quiet strength she had never expected from a man who commanded both respect and terror elsewhere. In these stolen moments, life slowed. The apartment above the bakery became a world apart, their shared sanctuary. And yet, the unspoken rule remained. Once the door closed behind him, Dominic Valenti returned to the city that knew him only as power, authority, and a name spoken with caution. Their lives, parallel yet intersecting, were now bound by a fragile balance, delicate, exhilarating, and entirely unsteady. The secret they shared became both sanctuary and burden. Celeste knew why Dominic remained distant in public. She understood the dangers that came with his life, the power he wielded, the scrutiny that followed every move. Yet comprehension did not erase the sting. Each time she saw him at upscale restaurants along the Magnificent Mile, his arm resting casually around socialites in designer dresses, she felt herself fade into the background. Their eyes sometimes met, and he would offer a brief, polite nod, as if acknowledging a stranger. The contrast between the intimacy of their nights and the coldness of his public life gnawed at her. Her heart clenched with each passing event where she witnessed him among his world. The laughter at galas, handshakes with city officials, fleeting smiles with women whose confidence and charm eclipsed her quiet presence. She reminded herself that his discretion protected her, yet the act of invisibility hurt in ways she had not anticipated. She began to notice the pattern. Dominic arrived late, stayed for a short time, and left before drawing attention. Every visit felt calculated, a constant negotiation between desire and duty. Celeste threw herself into her work at the Velvet Hour, pouring her energy into listening to strangers' stories, organizing the small bar, and keeping herself occupied. Yet, her thoughts drifted to him more often than she admitted. Every text unanswered, every call ignored, became a reminder of the boundaries Dominic maintained, boundaries she longed to see removed. The love she felt was tangled with frustration, loyalty with longing, affection with resentment. She could not reconcile the man who was gentle in private with the man who disregarded her publicly. Meanwhile, Dominic felt the strain of his divided existence. Each encounter outside the apartment tested him. He noticed the glances Celeste cast in his direction, the way her posture stiffened when others approached him. He felt guilty, knowing that the facade necessary for his empire wounded the woman he cherished. His associates noticed his distractions. Shipments delayed, decisions deferred, small errors creeping into operations that once ran like clockwork. Even rivals sensed a shift, interpreting hesitation as weakness. He tried small gestures to ease the tension. Flowers left anonymously, letters slipped beneath her door, messages of concern and admiration. Celeste received them with mixed emotions. The gestures reminded her of their connection, yet they could not replace the visibility she craved, the acknowledgement that he had chosen her not only in private but in the life he could not leave. The distance he imposed in public became a wedge, pushing against the intimacy they fought to preserve. The city around them continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the private struggles that occupied the spaces between a Mafia boss and a bartender. Each moment apart magnified the stakes. Celeste began to notice the small cracks in Dominic's control, fleeting anger, moments of distraction, the way his fingers drummed against his leg during conversations with colleagues. These glimpses revealed the depth of his attachment and the conflict it caused. He was still the man who commanded fear, yet now tethered by emotion to someone outside that world. Their private life remained a sanctuary, yet it was no longer enough. Even within the apartment above the bakery, tension lingered beneath the surface. Celeste struggled with the duality, loving a man who could destroy her life in public yet choosing to protect her in private. Each act of devotion reminded her of the fragility of their arrangement, and every absence reminded her that she was unseen. The dissonance became increasingly difficult to bear. Nights of laughter and warmth were followed by days of distance and invisibility. Celeste's patience thinned, and Dominic's worry deepened. Both recognized the danger of imbalance. For him, it risked the stability of his empire. For her, it risked the heart she could not relinquish. The tension stretched between them, taut and unyielding, each aware that it would take more than time to reconcile the extremes of their worlds. They clung to the fragments of normalcy wherever they could find them. Shared meals, whispered conversations, and brief touches became lifelines. The moments reminded them why they persisted despite the strain. The connection between them was undeniable, magnetic, and worth the pain. Yet each interaction carried the unspoken question: how long could their love survive in a world that demanded they remain apart in public? February arrived with bitter winds sweeping across River North. The art gallery buzzed with conversation, patrons sipping wine, admiring abstract canvases and sculptures that lined the polished floors. Celeste attended that evening, drawn by a new exhibition that promised quiet inspiration and a temporary escape from her own tangled thoughts. She moved among the crowd, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, whiskey-colored eyes scanning the room, momentarily distracted from the undercurrent of her own heartache. Dominic Valenti was already present, leaning slightly against a marble column, the tailored lines of his black suit precise, his expression unreadable. He was accompanied by a woman who drew attention effortlessly, her confidence radiating as she spoke with other patrons. Celeste's stomach twisted as she realized who he was with. She froze at the edge of the room, a cocktail glass trembling slightly in her hand. Their eyes met across the space, a flicker of recognition, a brief acknowledgement of their shared history, but it was fleeting. An associate, sensing an opportunity, leaned close to Dominic and asked, "Who's the brunette staring at you?" Dominic's response cut through the soft murmur of the gallery, "No one important. Just some bartender who pours my drinks." The words struck Celeste like a blow. She could hear the subtle shift in the room, the quiet hum of curiosity rising around them. Eyes that had previously been indifferent now held the faintest glint of judgment. She felt the weight of strangers' attention, their silent understanding of what had just occurred. Without another glance, she turned and fled, the sound of her heels echoing against the marble floors, her coat flaring behind her as she pushed through the gallery doors into the freezing night. The cold hit her immediately, sharp against her damp hair. She stumbled across the frozen streets, tears cutting paths down her cheeks. Every step carried the memory of his words, the public dismissal that had shattered the fragile balance they had maintained. The city moved around her in indifferent motion, taxis skidding along slick roads, pedestrians wrapped tightly in coats, oblivious to the personal storm that had just erupted. For 2 weeks, Celeste avoided his calls. She altered her shifts at the Velvet Hour, buried herself in writing, filling notebooks with stories that captured the betrayal and humiliation she had endured. Each word became a small act of reclamation, a way to assert herself in a life where she had been rendered invisible. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary, became a place of quiet reflection and bitter determination. Dominic, in turn, felt the consequences of his misstep. His associates noticed the tension in his posture, the way his attention wavered during meetings, the slight hesitation in decisions he would normally make without thought. Operations that had been flawless for years faltered. Shipments were delayed, deals threatened, rivals sensing an unusual vulnerability. Even small gestures, flowers left at her door, letters filled with apology and longing, were returned unopened. Men stationed discreetly outside her building noted her movements but saw nothing beyond the exterior of her composed demeanor. The public humiliation had escalated into a private war of patience and longing. Each day apart was a test of endurance, of willpower, and of desire. Dominic's power could not reach into the quiet spaces of her solitude, and she refused to step into his world unless it acknowledged her presence openly. Their lives, intertwined in secrecy, now felt fractured in ways that threatened everything they had built together. Yet, the pull between them remained undeniable. Each night, when Celeste closed her eyes, memories of whispered conversations and shared laughter haunted her, a constant reminder of what had been and what might still be. Dominic, for his part, moved through the city with the same precision and control as always, but the absence of her presence left a hollow ache he could not ignore. It was clear to both of them, the private rituals, the quiet moments in apartments above the city streets, were no longer sufficient to sustain their bond. Something had to change, and the coming days would demand courage neither had expected to summon. For the first time, Celeste refused to answer Dominic's calls. Her phone rang endlessly, each vibration a reminder of the night at the gallery, of his words that had cut deeper than any physical wound. She traded shifts at the Velvet Hour, filling her evenings with writing, letting the ink carry the weight of betrayal she could not otherwise release. Notebooks piled high with stories of love, loss, and quiet revenge became her refuge. Dominic, accustomed to control, found himself adrift. His associates noticed a change. His orders lacked the usual sharpness, and meetings that once concluded in his favor now left him restless, pacing private rooms at headquarters in Fulton Market. Deals faltered, shipments were delayed, and rival factions began sensing vulnerability in a man whose fearlessness had always been absolute. Dominic's empire, built over 20 years, teetered on the edges of a tension he had never anticipated. Determined to protect her even as he struggled with his own remorse, Dominic took discreet measures. Men stationed near her apartment watched over the building, ensuring her safety without intruding, reporting her routines back to him. Flowers, letters, even carefully written apologies were left at her doorstep, but she refused to open them, each unopened envelope a testament to her resolve and his misjudgment. Life in the city continued around them, indifferent to the private crisis unfolding in their lives. Celeste moved through the streets with cautious precision, aware of the gaze that might follow, yet unwilling to yield to fear. She poured herself into work, into friends, into the city itself, using every ounce of energy to shield herself from the pull of a man who had dominated her secret world and then publicly diminished it. Meanwhile, Dominic grappled with an unfamiliar helplessness. Nights at headquarters stretched long and silent, the city below glowing with life that did not touch him. The meticulous structure of his empire seemed fragile, his control slipping despite the loyalty of lieutenants and the fear he commanded. Every decision, once executed with absolute certainty, now carried a weight he could not dismiss. He realized, with an unfamiliar sting, that the one person he wanted most refused to be contained or defined by his world. Days stretched into weeks, each passing hour a negotiation of restraint. Celeste's resolve did not waver, and Dominic's desperation grew alongside it. He walked the streets in plain clothes, observing the life she had carved for herself, noting her routines without revealing himself. He could not act overtly without shattering the fragile dignity she maintained, and he could not ignore the longing that gnawed at him with every heartbeat. The tension reached a subtle crescendo when he learned that Celeste had begun showing her writing to a small circle of trusted friends. She read aloud fragments of stories that mirrored their own experience, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the longing, stories that only she could tell. Dominic felt each word like a direct strike to his chest, a reminder of both the pain he had caused and the deep bond he could no longer deny. 3 weeks after the gallery incident, the breaking point of the fracturing drew near. Dominic, unable to endure the distance any longer, decided to confront the situation directly. Rules he had imposed on himself, rules that governed his life and empire, fell aside. He would no longer wait for a signal of acceptance. The act itself carried risk. Risk to his pride, his carefully maintained persona, and even to the stability of the world he ruled. But the alternative, continuing to exist without her presence, was unbearable. That Saturday evening, the Velvet Hour brimmed with weekend patrons. Dominic pushed through the crowd, ignoring whispers, eyes following him as he made his way to the bar. He did not call attention to himself. He did not demand recognition. He simply stood there, presence undeniable, waiting for her to notice. Celeste, wiping down the counter, glanced up and caught sight of him. Her body tensed, instinct and caution warring with lingering curiosity and memory. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice calm, but the tension in it unmistakable. "I'm working," she replied, her tone firm, keeping her back straight and her eyes fixed on a stack of glasses. "Then I'll wait," he said, settling at the end of the bar, committing to patience, to the acknowledgement of her autonomy, even in the midst of his need. The hours stretched on, and as the last patrons left, a quiet settled over the room. It was here, in this emptiness, that the fracture between them would begin to mend, or break entirely. By the time the final customer left the Velvet Hour, the bar felt larger than ever, its silence stretching across polished wood and dim lighting. Dominic remained at the far end of the counter, posture rigid yet patient, his hands resting lightly on the edge. Celeste moved behind the bar, stacking glasses and cleaning counters, aware of his presence, every movement measured. Finally, she looked up. The familiar tension in her chest resurfaced, but she did not leave. She could not. Not after all the time, the thought, the lingering ache that his absence had left in her life. "I said I'd wait," he reminded her softly. There was no arrogance in his tone, no hint of command. Only a raw, unshielded truth that made her stomach tighten. Celeste leaned against the counter, eyes searching his. "Why are you here?" He exhaled slowly, as though steadying himself for the weight of what needed to be said. "Because I can't let it end this way. I've lived my life with rules, walls, a world where nothing mattered except control. I thought keeping you at a distance was protecting you. I was wrong. I hurt you instead. And I won't, accept losing you." Her jaw tightened. "You made me feel invisible. In front of everyone, you dismissed me. You humiliated me. Do you even understand what that feels like?" "I do," he admitted. His voice lowered, roughened by emotion he seldom revealed. "I said what I did to protect you from people who would use you to get to me. I see now that it was selfish. I see now it caused the very pain I was trying to prevent. You are everything. You are the only thing in my life that matters. And that terrifies me more than any enemy I've faced." Celeste's eyes glistened, her fingers curling around a glass she didn't even feel. "Terrified? That's your excuse? What about me? What about the trust you broke?" Dominic leaned forward slightly, the intensity of his gaze cutting through her defenses. "You are right. I failed you. I failed myself. I have no right to demand forgiveness. But I can promise this, I will try, every day, to do better. Not because of rules, not because of power, not because anyone else in the city could care. But because of you. Because of us. You make me remember the man I could have been before I built walls around everything that mattered. You make me want to change, not for the world but for you." A tense silence filled the room. Celeste's pulse raced, heart pulled between anger, longing, and something tender that refused to be denied. She studied him, seeing the vulnerability beneath the steel, the fear of losing her for good, the truth in the steadiness of his gaze. "Do you even know what it will take?" she asked quietly. "For me to trust you again? For us to have something that doesn't hurt every time we breathe near each other?" Dominic nodded. "I know. And I know it won't be easy. I will fail, I will stumble, and I will have to earn back every moment of your trust. But I am ready to face that. All of it. Because nothing in this world is worth more to me than this, than you." Her breath hitched, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself relax slightly, though caution remained. "You better mean that. I won't bend for anyone. Not for a name, not for a life built on fear. Not even for you." "I mean it," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I can't undo the past, but I can face the future with you. If you'll let me." Celeste looked around the empty bar, seeing the ghosts of conversations past, of laughter and shared stories, of nights filled with quiet understanding. She saw the man who had terrified everyone else in the city, now vulnerable before her. The man who had once treated her as if she were nothing, now placing everything he had at her feet. A single nod from her was all it took. No words, no grand declarations beyond what had been spoken. It was enough. Dominic allowed himself a small, controlled exhale, knowing the real work would begin the next day, the day after that, and for countless days to follow. He stood, crossing the small space between them, reaching out gently. Celeste did not step back. She let his hand brush against hers, light but deliberate. No promises were exchanged beyond the commitment to try, but it was a start, a fragile, undeniable start that neither of them could ignore. The velvet hour, quiet now, held their shared moment in its dimly lit corners. Outside, Chicago moved through the night unaware, the city's heartbeat echoing theirs. For the first time, the walls Dominic had built felt permeable. For the first time, Celeste allowed herself to hope. The fracture had begun to heal, but the journey ahead would test both of them in ways neither could predict. Yet in this room, in the stillness, they found a rare truth, that even amidst danger, betrayal, and a city that thrived on ambition and survival, they could find each other, and perhaps find a way to stay together. The weeks after that night at the Velvet Hour were quiet, almost painfully so. Dominic no longer arrived in a black Mercedes with tinted windows. He left his phone behind more often than not, and the bodyguards who had once shadowed him relentlessly now kept a discreet distance. Each day was a careful negotiation between old habits and the new life he wanted to build with Celeste. Within his organization, Dominic's changes were met with disbelief. Shipments that had once moved under his direct supervision were now delegated to lieutenants he had trusted for years. Decisions that required his signature were signed with a new patience, a willingness to consult others rather than command. Violence became a last resort instead of a tool of demonstration. Some men whispered doubts, others watched, curious, as the feared boss showed restraint they had never imagined possible. Dominic focused on legitimate ventures, restaurants, warehouses, and import-export businesses where profit replaced fear. He avoided the extravagant events where his presence had once been demanded, choosing instead a quiet dinner in Bucktown, a long walk along Navy Pier, hands brushing casually, sharing the kind of conversations that had nothing to do with power or danger. Publicly, he acknowledged Celeste for the first time. It started small, a casual nod at a street corner, a shared laugh in front of a waiter, a hand on her back as they entered a gallery together. Rumors rippled through the city's underworld. The man who had inspired fear from the north side to the south was now touched by something personal, something that made him cautious, deliberate, human. Even in these small steps, Dominic felt the weight of years he had spent building walls. Each gesture toward Celeste required thought, each word measured against the possibility of losing her again. Trust, once broken, demanded more than apologies. It required proof, consistency, and patience. And Dominic, who had never learned patience for anyone, discovered that proving himself was a test greater than any he had faced in business or battle. Celeste, too, felt the slow shift. She noticed the dinners, the quiet evenings by the lake, the way he listened without judgment, and without the need to control. Slowly, she let herself believe that the man she had known in secret, the man who had once terrified the city and yet trembled at her name, could exist in her life outside of shadows. By the time the first snow fell over Chicago, their connection had deepened into something fragile but steady. Every step forward was tentative, every moment a challenge to the past, but for the first time, both were willing to walk the path together, aware that rebuilding trust required time, persistence, and an openness neither had fully known before. Dominic's efforts to change did not go unnoticed. In the underworld, hesitation was weakness, and any sign of softness invited challenge. Rivals began testing boundaries, probing for flaws, looking for cracks in the armor of a man who had once struck fear into everyone around him. Within his own ranks, some associates whispered doubts, questioning whether the man who had ruled through precision and control could now balance affection with authority. The threat became undeniable one evening when Celeste stepped off the train near her apartment in Pilsen. A car ran the red light, swerving dangerously close, missing her by inches. She froze, heart hammering, as the world seemed to tilt. Dominic arrived moments later, furious and pale, assessing the street, the vehicle, the potential witnesses. His response was decisive. Contacts he had not used in years received messages they could not ignore. The message was clear: anyone who harmed her would face consequences that would echo across the city. From that night onward, Dominic was a constant presence, not in a way that suffocated, but in a way that reassured. He stayed by her side through sleepless nights, holding her close as she trembled, allowing her the space to breathe and regain calm. He installed security that was discreet yet effective, ensuring that every step she took outside her apartment was safe, but that she still retained her freedom. Every protective measure came with a promise. Dominic spoke often of a future where fear would not govern their days, where they could exist together without shadows looming. He learned to measure his instinct to control, balancing it with a respect for her independence. Celeste, in turn, began to trust the walls he built, recognizing that they were meant to shield, not confine. Together, they navigated danger as a team, understanding that love in their world demanded vigilance and courage. Each challenge reinforced their bond rather than breaking it. Dominic realized that his power meant little if he could not protect the person who mattered most. Celeste discovered that safety could exist without surrendering her agency. By the time winter's edge softened into spring, they had found a rhythm, a life of careful steps, quiet protection, and mutual respect. The price of love had been high, and the city's dangers remained, but facing them together had transformed fear into trust, and trust into something neither of them had anticipated, hope. Dominic and Celeste understood that their story was not a neatly tied tale. Life did not grant clean resolutions, and the challenges of their world remained, unyielding and unrelenting. Yet, in facing these obstacles, each discovered profound truths about themselves and each other. Dominic learned that his strength had never been solely in dominance or fear. True power came from allowing himself to be seen, to show vulnerability without losing his sense of control. The walls he had built around his heart no longer served him, they had only isolated him. To need someone, to trust someone completely, was not weakness. It was courage, a lesson earned through late nights of confession, whispered fears, and shared laughter. Celeste, in turn, discovered that love required boundaries as much as devotion. To care for someone did not mean surrendering her own identity. Loving Dominic demanded recognition of his capacity for growth, his struggle to reconcile his past with who he wanted to become. She found that support and honesty, paired with self-respect, could hold even the most complicated love intact. Together, they learned to navigate the space between who they had been and who they aspired to be. Daily choices became acts of commitment, choosing patience over frustration, compassion over judgment, courage over fear. Their connection deepened not in grand gestures, but in quiet understanding, in moments of shared vulnerability, in the mutual effort to meet each other halfway. In the rhythm of their lives, a powerful truth emerged. Love often arrives in places we least expect, demanding openness when instinct urges caution. Vulnerability became the foundation of their intimacy, a bridge that transformed fear into trust, and trust into enduring closeness. They realized that to love fiercely was to fight for connection, to fight for patience, and to fight for acceptance. It was not a guarantee of perfection, nor a shield against hardship. Instead, it was the choice to meet life together, willing to face both the shadows and the light. In each other, they found the courage to hope, the strength to forgive, and the commitment to grow, not despite their challenges, but because of them. Summer settled over Chicago, warming the lakefront path past North Avenue Beach. Dominic walked beside Celeste, his steps confident yet lighter than before, the weight of constant vigilance easing with each quiet evening they spent together. She leaned into him, laughter slipping freely between them as their fingers intertwined, an unspoken affirmation of the life they were building. The velvet hour still welcomed its regulars, its familiar hum of conversation and clinking glasses echoing the countless nights Celeste had spent behind the bar. She no longer worked there, her time devoted to finishing her novel, a story of love, of violence, of the city that shaped them both. Copies now lined shelves across Chicago, the streets they had walked together reflected in each chapter, a testament to what they had endured and the bond that had grown between them. Dominic's world had shifted quietly but decisively. Deals once cemented through fear and intimidation now moved with calculated diplomacy, the bloodshed that had marked his rise replaced by ventures that could endure without destruction. He attended Mass with a sincerity that surprised those who knew him, prayers flowing from gratitude instead of penance, each moment a recognition of the life he could live when anchored to something, or someone, real. Marriage was never discussed, and perhaps it never would be. Yet that absence mattered little. They had built something neither had expected, a love that persisted through fear, through past mistakes, through the dangers of his former life. It was steady, resilient, and deeply alive. In a city defined by ambition and survival, Dominic and Celeste's story continued. Each evening offered a reminder that even in corners shaped by shadows, light could be found, nurtured, and shared. They walked side by side along the shores of Lake Michigan, two people who had discovered each other in darkness and had chosen to stay, facing life together with an understanding that courage and connection mattered more than control. If this story moved you, leave a comment and share where you're watching from. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story that captures the heart. Remember, Sometimes the person we hesitate to let in is the one who sees us most clearly, and holds the power to change us forever.